So without further ado, I wanted to introduce our first speaker this week, today. Lucy is from the Digital Public Goods Alliance, and she has been working there for about a year, and will introduce far better than I ever can what the Digital Public Goods Alliance does. So Lucy, I wanted to hand over to you, and the floor is yours.
Absolutely, thank you. I'm very excited to be here this morning, Canada time. Let me see if I can share my slides here. Great, is that visible?
Yes.
Wonderful. So yes, hello, my name is Lucy Harris, and I co-lead the Digital Public Goods Alliance, which I will get into more detail later. But I want to kick off this conversation today about how open innovation can solve big problems with a bit of a story. So in Sri Lanka, the first suspected case of COVID was registered on January 27th, 2020. And immediately, local developers got to work to build a COVID-19 tracker for a different digital public good called DHIS2. DHIS2 is an open source health information management system that was being used in Sri Lanka. And so the Sri Lankan developers got together and started to build a tracker for COVID that would focus on the registration and tracking of travelers arriving from regions with a high risk of COVID-19 infection. They were able to create this within 2 days of that first registered COVID case and deployed it in Sri Lanka's airport just a few days later. So the speed and efficiency with which Sri Lanka was able to respond to this crisis is actually not the most impressive part of the story. The most impressive part is what came next, which is how quickly this innovation was able to be picked up and adapted by other countries. So because DHIS2 is currently used in 73 countries, when Sri Lanka developed their COVID-19 tracker and shared their user guide with the global DHIS2 COVID response team, the application was communicated quickly across the global community and is now operational in 38 countries and being adapted for use in 14 more. So I think hopefully you can already see how this is an example of an open innovation solving a big problem. And some of the themes that are related there, how they tie back to Mojaloop and how it's setting up as the rails that other solutions kind of build on. But both of these solutions, it's not a coincidence that this open innovation solved a big problem. The way the technology was designed and developed set it up for this specific kind of success. When a solution is open licensed, it means that it's easy for others to adapt it to their circumstance. And then beyond having the right license, this tracker was also transparently documented. So they didn't just have the license, they had the documentation that transmitted the knowledge of how to build, share, and use it. And then the third component is that it addressed a common problem. The solution had broad value and was important to many different countries. So at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, we call these kind of technologies digital public goods. And digital public goods are open source technologies or content, including software, data, standards, or AI models that have been built to adhere to relevant best practices, laws, standards, do no harm, and advance the Sustainable Development Goals. These are goods that we believe need to be identified, recognized, and supported because of their capacity to help achieve the SDGs. So this idea isn't new, but there has definitely been a growing focus on the idea of digital public goods in the last year or so. I think this is largely driven by a recognition that the process of digital transformation needs effective, adoptable, open tools to be successful. In the 2019 high-level panel on digital cooperation, the UN Secretary General, recognizing the potential of digital public goods to reduce fragmentation and duplication, said that all actors, including member states, the UN system, private sector, and other stakeholders, should be promoting open source, and especially those solutions that adhere to privacy and other applicable laws, standards, best practices, and do no harm. So this recommendation in the roadmap for digital cooperation actually led to the establishment of the Digital Public Goods Alliance, but I'm going to come back to that a little bit later. For now, I want to look a little bit more at digital public goods. And at the heart of digital public goods, or DPGs, there are three components. First is that they advance the Sustainable Development Goals. The second is that they are open source. And the third is that they do no harm. And we extrapolate on this, but I want to take a second to dive into open source, because though I know it's a big part of this conference so far, it's also often a term that not everyone is equally familiar with. And so I want to take a second to define it, especially because it's so much at the heart of Mojaloop, but also digital public goods in general. So open source refers to something historically software that people can modify, share, and reuse because its design or the source code is publicly accessible. And I often use the analogy of thinking of it as a recipe where you have the opportunity to give someone a loaf of bread, but you can also, or instead, you can give them the recipe so that they can see it, they can modify it, and they can make it their own. The other component of open source is this license. So open source products provide this kind of universal access through an open source license that legally enables that access. And I think the licenses, it can sound not that interesting, but it's super critical to making something open source. It's the difference between a good intention, yeah, we plan on sharing this publicly, with a commitment to that open access. And for us at the Digital Public Goods Alliance, we require all solutions to demonstrate use of an approved open license in order to be recognized as a digital public good. So open source solutions have huge benefits. I'm sure you heard a bunch about this yesterday as well. But a few things to call out is their transparency. It makes them much more easily adopted by others. They're flexible. Other people can come in and build around it or innovate on the solution, so they can be more easily adapted to local and regional contexts. And then they have the potential to increase capacity by letting you build a community around a solution and to engage external players in the development and also the proliferation of your solution. We believe open source is a critical tool for achieving sustainable development goals and is an important facet of ensuring the benefits of technology are equitably realized across the world. So the goal of an equitable world is at the core of the Digital Public Goods Alliance and the work we do to identify and promote digital public goods. So let me tell you a little bit more about who we are and what we do. So the DPGA, and I apologize for all the acronyms, is a multi-stakeholder alliance founded by UNICEF, the government of Norway, the government of Sierra Leone, and the think tank iSpirit. And the Digital Public Goods Alliance has a mission to accelerate attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals in low and middle income countries by facilitating the discovery, development, use of, and investment in digital public goods. Today, the Digital Public Goods Alliance has expanded, is expanding to include a growing list of organizations committed to advancing a shared vision, transparently monitoring and sharing their activities, as well as working collaboratively to advance digital public goods. So in the past month, BMZ, the government of Germany, UNDP, and the Office of the Envoy on Technology within the UN, as well as GitHub, have all joined the Alliance as members. And we are continuously adding new members to the Alliance. So why do we exist, though? We believe that the need for quality digital public goods that are accessible, openly licensed, adaptable, and quickly deployable is greater than ever, especially now in the time of COVID. However, this transformative potential cannot be fully or equitably realized unless we also transform the complex systems, structures, and practices in which DPGs are embedded. So if we agree that all countries, and in particular low and middle income countries, need digital technologies to be able to attain the Sustainable Development Goals, there needs to be prioritization of digital solutions that improve public service delivery and encourage private sector innovation. So the Digital Public Goods Alliance works to coordinate and align these multiple different stakeholders who are committed to doing just that. And one of the core functions of the Alliance is stewarding and maintaining this Dpg standard. So the Dpg standard is a set of 9 indicators that create a baseline of requirements that must be met in order for a solution to earn recognition as a digital public good. So solutions have to enable that kind of open innovation we talked about in the first story. And that means yes, using an open license, but also having good documentation, data that is accessible, non-PII data, having a commitment to standards, best practices, as well as do no harm, which in the full standard breaks into privacy, security, protection from harassment. So in order to become a digital public good, project is first nominated. Anyone can nominate a digital solution, but most of the time we see nominations come from product owners. And it's helpful if someone has a good familiarity with the design and development of a solution so that they can speak to things like how was it designed? What does the documentation look like? What are the privacy and security steps that have been taken? Then we've got a team that reviews the solution against the standard, which, as I mentioned, breaks down into a number of additional indicators. And we have all of these questions that try and understand that openness, the interoperability, and the adoptability of a solution. Once a solution is registered as a DPG, it appears on the registry, which, to get a little bit meta, is itself an open project. So there's an open API, and appearing on the registry automatically populates other catalogs of digital solutions maintained by external parties. Today, we have recognized 60 solutions as digital public goods, while many more open solutions are also discoverable as nominees. And nominated digital solutions are ones that either have been reviewed and don't meet the standard yet, but are open source and are moving in the right direction, or are waiting to be reviewed. So here are just a few examples of digital public goods, including OpenG2P, which enables humanitarian relief payments, DHIS2, which we spoke about earlier, the health information system, MOSIP, the identity platform, and of course, Mojaloop. So in the last year, we've seen growing international consensus around the need to accelerate digitization of public financing as a driver of financial inclusion and the broader 2030 agenda. According to the United Nations Secretary General's Task Force on Digital Financing, digitization improves the efficiency of government transfers to citizens, and digitization of social protection programs can positively impact the way women participate in economies. In this context, last year, we were very pleased to recognize Mojaloop as a digital public good. As required by the standard, Mojaloop uses an open source license, Apache 2.0, which means that anyone can build on top of it and create opportunities like the one we saw in Sri Lanka. As well as being an openly licensed digital solution, it addresses a critical requirement for DPGs, which is that it has been developed to advance the Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs, and I've mentioned them a lot, so apologies if you're not familiar with them, but they represent a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. And by creating payment platforms that will help unbanked people access digital financial services, Mojaloop advances several of the SDGs, and even more than I've put on this slide, but I wanted to highlight a few here. So SDG 1, no poverty, and SDG 2, reduced inequalities, really stand out to me as things that enabling this kind of payment platforms to be built that provide direct payments, touching on what was said in the Secretary General's task force about the way that positively impacts women. There's a huge impact here. However, I also want to take a moment to focus on its role in SDG 9, which is building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. So Mojaloop plays an important role, not just as a digital public good, but as a solution with the potential to be implemented as part of a country's digital public infrastructure. So now I want to take a second to talk about the intersection of digital public goods and digital public infrastructure, especially as it relates to financial inclusion. And I think this is a particularly interesting topic right now, and has been for the DPGA over the last 9 months, because COVID-19 has really highlighted this urgent need for countries to build out their digital public infrastructure. And then as governments who had robust digital systems in place, we saw that they were better equipped to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak, not only in their direct health response, but also by targeting vulnerable populations and delivering payments into people's accounts to mitigate the economic hardships caused by the outbreaks. So what do we mean when we say digital public infrastructure? I think unlike digital public goods, where we have that very clear definition, there's not one unified definition of digital public infrastructure, but it's generally used to describe technologies that are cross-sectorally enabling, serving as the rails, and you heard that analogy earlier, I really like it, serving as the rails that public and private service delivery can run on top of. Their implementation typically enables many other solutions and business models to flourish. And because of their ability to sustain and underlie other technologies, these DPIs can have a disproportionately positive impact on achieving a government's goals or the Sustainable Development Goals. Conversely, though, when DPIs are not well designed and well implemented, they can do harm to the economy and society. And it is in the global interest that they are built to serve society's poor and marginalized groups, safeguard human rights, and enable a diverse and flourishing economic system. We therefore see this as an extremely critical role for solutions that are both digital public goods and have the potential to be deployed as part of a country's digital public infrastructure. And I think nowhere is the relevance of this kind of intersection clearer than when we're talking about financial inclusion. So financial inclusion has been, I'm sure, a hot topic throughout this whole conference so far. It's a key step towards enabling attainment of numerous sustainable development goals, but it needs robust digital solutions to enable it. And as the global community is searching for solutions that will assist countries in their efforts to build back better, as we hopefully come to see in the distance the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, fostering greater financial inclusion is going to be key. And so in recognition of this, in September 2020, the Digital Public Goods Alliance convened a community of practice for financial inclusion. The DPGA regularly convenes groups of experts within specific sectors in order to support the discovery, assessment, and advancement of high potential digital public goods within a specific priority area. And the aim of the financial inclusion community of practice was to identify digital public goods with the potential to drive financial inclusion at scale. So as we started to have conversations with these groups of experts, one of the things that was very clear very quickly is that if we were looking for technologies with the most potential impact, we needed to focus on those horizontally enabling projects, those rails that have the capacity to facilitate inclusive financial workflows as part of a country's digital public infrastructure. So then earlier this summer, around August 30th, we released a report highlighting these digital public goods. So in addition to projects that met the Dpg standard, for each solution, we considered whether it facilitated inclusive financial workflows across state, market, and consumer, and looked for evidence that the solution enabled other solutions as digital public infrastructure. The result of this review was highlighting 6 solutions that, as well as being DPGs, were DPIs. And these projects are listed here: Apache Fineract, MIFOS, MOSIP, OpenCRVS, Xroad, and of course, Mojaloop. All of these have now been highlighted by the DPGA solutions that should be considered for additional funding, development, and deployment because of their importance in this space. So where do we go from here? We hopefully understanding a little bit more about open source, what digital public goods are, and the potential they have to solve big problems in financial inclusion and beyond. What are the next steps? So for the Digital Public Goods Alliance, we have a vision of a world in which DPGs are discoverable, accessible, and sustainable, so that their full potential to contribute to a more equitable world and accelerate the attainment of the SDGs is realized. We believe DPGs accelerate innovation, promote economic development, and address the digital divide by reducing monopolies, powering startups, and promoting innovation in the public and private sectors. While the cost of procuring the services needed to implement open source software may be comparable to the cost of leasing proprietary systems in the short term, in the long term, open source offers more control and independence, as well as the opportunity to build capacity, trust, and innovation around your digital systems. My hope is that this conversation today, and hopefully that will continue in the Q&A after I'm done speaking, has inspired you to think about digital tools a little bit differently. Systems in place today are not always set up to make it easy for you to choose digital public goods. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes open source needs different investments and capacity building than traditional proprietary solutions. And there is work to be done in addressing people's discomfort, challenges that make it harder to procure an open source system versus a proprietary system. But those challenges are being addressed. And we're working to make it easy for everyone to build, use, and invest in digital public goods. We think technologists, governments, and funders all have a role to play. And as we saw in Sri Lanka, and I think as we're seeing throughout this whole conference with Mojaloop, DPGs really have the potential to transform the way we solve problems and offer new opportunities for innovation, collaboration, and development. Thank you for your time today, and hopefully we'll have a good chunk of time then to do questions.
Lucy, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for that introduction to what exactly is the Digital Public Goods Alliance. Anyone in the audience got any questions that they want to ask? Feel free to put your hand up if you want me to call on you, or I can read comments from the questions from the chat window. Whilst I spot hands up in the audience, or turn your camera on if you want to speak either. There's a question from Stephen in the chat. Who develops international digital financial inclusion standards and how are they enforced? Have you got any thoughts on that, Lucy?
That is a great question. I will say that it goes a little bit beyond the scope of the DPGA around kind of international digital financial inclusion standards. So I don't have a very good answer to that. Maybe there's someone in the audience who has more of a financial background who would have that information.
Certainly from the Mojaloop Foundation perspective, we think a lot about standards around financial inclusion. So what I was talking to earlier was some of our thinking around what makes a double click into good for financial inclusion. And so our Discovery Agreement Transfer Protocol is fundamentally set up to help banks and hub operators, those payment system operators, think about what does good look like with a financial inclusion audience in mind. And then we think about also how to link that to the ISO 20022 and settlement rails world as well. And so I guess for us, it's very, very important to be thinking about it. Are we a standard? We're working with standards bodies, but we're very much, we have, for example, a change control board around our API protocol. We fundamentally host that in the open. And as a consequence, maybe that actually, Stephen, is part of the answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so very much. And that was a fantastic presentation. I'm much clearer on digital financial public goods. I like it when you use the word public because, yes, we all serve the public. And one of the things I participated in for a long time is the need to appreciate the standard setting bodies. And in this case, the standard setting body, ISO, has got a committee called Technical Committee number 68, which looks at standards for financial services. And it takes a long time to develop them. So the question one would want to do, and especially when you are talking about open source and APIs, and I am not ignorant of the fact that APIs have also cost a lot of charges to financial services. So the question I'm asking, and you mentioned it, and I was very happy when you mentioned it, is that they are international standards. The question then comes, how does it become international? Something can become international if you claim it is international, but how does it relate to the standard setting bodies like ISO? And that's why I wanted to ask you, now that you mentioned it, how does it become international? How will I start using it and start saying that it's international? And I think this is where this whole issue of open source comes in to collide with the international standard setting bodies. Many are fraud that you see out there is because a technology did not meet the standards. And it's one thing to claim it does, is another one to prove that it does. Just a charity to the open source community. These are good ideas, but they don't become good if they create a financial fraud. which we have seen even in mobile payments. We have good examples of frauds that are caused by use of APIs that are not meeting any known standards. Just a comment, maybe just invite others to talk about it. Thank you.
It's a really interesting point, and actually, I think it is where the heart of Modular App Foundation has started from, exactly what you're talking about. We actually brought the vendors of mobile money platforms together to come up with the Modular App standard. And now we're working with ISO 222 to say, how do we put the two worlds together? So fundamentally, a little bit of what we're trying to achieve with Modular App is exactly what you're talking about: create that community of vendors and create compatibility to standards and get them internationalized. So fundamentally, hopefully we're on the right track there. Lucy, there's some awesome questions in the chat coming through. One from David. Can you say more about how DPGA is thinking about how to govern digital public goods and infrastructure, since aligning the incentives can be tricky?
That is a great question. So I think there are a bunch of different governance approaches for digital public goods. And I think there's not a one-size-fits-all approach about how any particular digital public good should be governed. I think we often see things like a foundation that is kind of maintaining the digital public good or the open source project, and it has a board with a combination of funders and experts and product owners. For some of those, they have kind of much more kind of community-driven governance structures. Some of them even kind of have voting systems in play where contributors to those products can actually shape the roadmap. And for others, it's more of kind of a traditional foundation structure, or there's a board that is driving the product roadmap. I think that one of the things that maybe makes it tricky as what comes in here is funding digital public goods. I think that the source code being free doesn't mean, I think as many of us know here, the solution can't make money and can't be structured in a way that is profitable. And then there are major funders who are interested in coming in and giving money to digital public goods and to support them in the long term. And then there's kind of bilateral donors or governments. And I think especially when we're talking about infrastructure, there's actually I would say it's almost easier if you're looking at large infrastructural digital public goods, because I think for private sector players, they see if this digital infrastructure is in place, they'll be able to build their proprietary systems on top of it. And so that there is often an alignment of incentives there where, if this digital payment system is in place, they'll be able to build on top of it, or an ID system or whatever that is, as well as governments, I think, especially right now, realizing that this is a need that they want to have in place for themselves, but also if they're supporting internationally, that they are in a position to provide kind of stable long-term funding to digital public goods, where that infrastructure is going to have a really like ricochet effect for multiple countries potentially, as we saw in my first example. To be clear, the DPGA doesn't directly govern any digital public goods. We do maintain the Digital Public Goods Standard, which defines digital public goods, but we don't do any of the direct governance. And I think as we see more and more projects thinking about the different governance models, and we are planning to put out a report about some different structures, and it's an ongoing conversation that I think is really useful.
Thank you, Lucy. There's a couple of linked questions in the chat. When we say help countries to set up rails, do we mean governments or the private sector within these countries? And will there be compliance and technical education for new participants and new capabilities? But actually, another very linked question: can you talk to the hurdles to be overcome in acquiring and using open source? Now you're referring to the entire deploy, run, maintain issues for open source. Is that how do we actually get from software in GitHub to running infrastructure, and your thoughts in that kind of space?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I could say there weren't many hurdles, but I think there actually are quite a few. So I think there's still a challenge about being sustainable as an open source project and figuring out how you're going to make money in kind of a traditional business model or bringing funders on board. I think things are still not there's an assumption that things will work in a proprietary system. Someone will pay for your license and that would be how it's done. I think another challenge that comes in there is that many kind of large entities, whether it's governments or kind of UN agencies, for example, are not really set up to procure open source in a very simple way. All of the legal departments and everything is set up to assume that you're going to pay a license fee and then you're going to get like a turnkey solution. That's going to be the end of it. And open source solutions with all their benefits require, you're not just paying for a license, you're setting up potentially your own implementation, figuring out what you want in that. And it's a whole different set of things that you're paying for and setting up. It's not just the proprietary system. And so for some people, they've got a solution, they're super excited about it, but there's still all these hoops they need to jump through in their own organizations. And some of them can be very challenging. I think in the same way, funders and supporters of digital public goods also have not necessarily set up their programs to be able to give money to an open source project when there's not, maybe one clear owner, or how is the solution going to be controlled moving forward. So I think there's a bunch of challenges around there. Let me see.
So
possibly go to the next question as well. Sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned particular Pathfinder countries on your website. Is there any way to unpack a little bit what that means any further?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Digital Public Goods Alliance is an alliance of multiple different organizations. And I mentioned a few of the major participants, so UNICEF, Sierra Leone, the government of Norway. And what we do is we support them to run in-country programs related to specific digital public goods or education and advocacy for digital public goods. And so they're mainly driven by the partners. So, for example, UNICEF in the Philippines is running a whole program to accelerate digital public goods in the Philippines. Norway is supporting specific implementations of different digital public goods, as well as project like the Global Digital Library, which is looking at digital public goods content and having that translated into multiple different languages through partnership with those countries. And then the DPGA Secretariat looks at what's all happening and tries to connect the dots between the different initiatives that are happening on the ground to make sure that learnings are being shared and that opportunities that are maybe kind of being uncovered by one pathfinding pilot is then conveyed to the rest of the members of the Alliance.
And if anyone in the Mojito community wanted to know more about either Pathfinder countries and how to become one, or about how to connect into Pathfinder projects, what would they do?
So, one easy way would be to reach out to me, and I'm happy to share my email after this. There's also on the website, we have a write-up about some of the kind of goes into more detail of the specific pathfinding initiatives. And what we do is we talk about, okay, what are the goals there? And then we would also work with our members to identify kind of what are they focused on in terms of pathfinding.
So there was a super question in the chat that I missed, and I went back up. A number of times you mentioned do no harm. Can you give examples of the kind of thing you're trying to avoid?
Absolutely. And I know do no harm is a bold statement. And especially we do look at the way the technology was designed and developed. And we don't go, we're not continually assessing how a tool is being used once it's out there in the world, because do no harm is a difficult thing to measure. But what we do is we break it down into three big buckets when we're evaluating solutions. So the first is around data privacy and security. The second is around inappropriate and illegal content. So any project that collects, stores, or distribute content has to have policies in place to identify inappropriate and illegal content and a mechanism for detecting, moderating, and removing content. And the third is protection from harassment. So anytime a project facilitates interactions with or between users or contributors, there must be a mechanism for users and contributors to protect themselves against, we call grief, abuse, and harassment. So this is getting into having a community policy and making sure that if you're doing that facilitation, it's well set up. And the standard was built in consultation with a number of different organizations, and Do No Harm was always the one when we were having those conversations we spent the most time on, because it's quite broad. And I think even thinking about reframing that as taking steps to mitigate and avoid harm, because you can't guarantee that no one will do harm, especially when you're talking about tools that people can use and deploy in a bunch of different ways. But those three things, like kind of areas, data privacy and security, inappropriate and illegal content, and protection from harassment, are the three major pieces that we've pulled out.
Okay, super. There's another great question. Expanding on some of the other questions, do you have any good examples of governments going beyond just procuring or using open source, but also contributing back to the project actively?
That is a great question. I don't have a specific, like, this country did this, but I know that when the incentives are well set up, so looking at DHIS2, which is funded largely by the government of Norway. So there's a way in which and there are other governments that are funding and supporting digital public goods as a form of contribution, but also I think making sure the incentives are aligned so that people contribute back to the core and don't spend all their time kind of working on a fork, has definitely happened in the DHIS2 context, where there is a good culture within that kind of broad community of contributing back to the core. As a Canadian, there are a number of open source projects that have been built for pandemic response that were kind of a collaboration between the government and local tech hubs, where they not only developed it within kind of one part of the Canadian government or the province, then that was shared across, and each of them were able to contribute back to that project. So it is happening, but there's often a challenge, which is, you fork a project, you've got your own implementation, and then you just work on that forever. And I think it's something that needs to be thought about carefully, which is how can we make those incentives to actually contribute back to the core project. And we're doing in our advocacy a lot of work trying to have people think about the core project as the thing that needs to be kind of nurtured, supported, and sustained in order to be able to get these knock-on benefits. And then I think within each project, that's an ongoing challenge, and trying to make sure that projects can learn from each other how kind of one or another has been able to effectively incentivize that kind of contribution back to the core, because it is really important.
It's a huge conversation in the Widget community for sure. Exactly for the reasons you specify. Exactly the same way. So how do we make sure that the core keeps on improving, and rather than the kind of fork approach? And we're also very keen to stay aligned with you if you find some useful tips and tricks along the way. There's a great question here from Robert. This is probably one of the last questions we'll be able to have unless anyone kind of gets in quickly. How do we ignite the fintech community into the whole kind of movement of DPGA? I mean, OSS can do great things if we get public and private working together, but how do we get there? How do we turn this on?
I think it's great. And I think the fintech community especially is really ripe for this. I mean, open source is already like so many of the cryptocurrencies and stuff have open source at their core. It's not an unfamiliar concept in this space. I think the digital public goods component of taking open source, combining it with a kind of commitment to do good, to achieve the sustainable development goals, that combination is something where we're starting to see stories through solutions like Mojaloop, where it's really starting to make a difference. And especially, I think, with COVID, everyone realizes digitization needs to be a thing that happens right now. It needed to happen now to deal with the pandemic, but also as we start to look to economic recovery. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here where the knowledge of open source is already kind of in the background. And then the need for this to be kind of widespread is there. I really think it's going to come from examples. And I think that already when we've got stories kind of around, a country implements this digital payment system and things start working. And I think we're at this moment where that's happening more and more, and we're going to start getting these really easy to understand stories. And I think one of the challenges is that it can feel complex. It can feel very technical. And a lot of people who make decisions about even like procurement might feel like, oh, open source feels a little foreign to me. I'm not very comfortable with that concept. And so I really think that there's the confluence of factors coming together to make this possible. I'm already seeing much more openness to these conversations, many more kind of implementations of digital public goods in financial inclusion. And I think it's going to be key for us to kind of collectively pull out those stories of success that make it easy for people to understand why this works and communicate that, I think, over and over again in a way that's very compelling. And I think this conference is a great opportunity to do this, and starting this out actually fits back in very well.
And do you think there's a role for tactics versus strategic initiatives? So, for example, the role of design challenges, sponsored challenges, ways to get open source new players in front of old procurement processes. Do you think there's something to seed the conversation that we should be thinking about?
I mean, I think one of the challenges with challenges is, are you getting the same people? I mean, open source itself is not new. And I think it's been an internal conversation. It's been the people who know about open source, talk about open source and do open source, and everyone else doesn't. They live their lives and they're like, oh, look at those weird open source people over there. And I think the challenge is, how do we take this kind of moment in time, this opportunity to make it just something that everyone understands the value of and everyone sees that. And so I think finding innovative ways to speak to people we haven't been speaking to before and speaking their language. So I think there is room for kind of challenges that don't look like an open source challenge. How do we most effectively solve this problem? And then the answer is a digital public good and open source solution. I think that kind of thing is going to be key.
That is super interesting, actually, because later on today, our session that Paula is running will have the Alliance for Innovation and Regulation speaking alongside others, where exactly that approach to design challenges are taken, because frankly, it's about solving problems, not about software.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good. Well, thank you so much, Lacey. As Paula said in our chat, you've sparked some fantastic conversation in this chat. So thank you so much for joining us.